Hello, welcome to From Caracas. Today we'll be talking to Beto Almeida, an international analyst who's been part of Telesur in its 13 years. Welcome, Beto, to From Caracas.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Here I am at your service.
Hoy, aún varios días Today, a few days after the elections in Brazil, there are still protests against President-elect Jair Bolsonaro. Is there still hope for Brazil? What is real? What the real desire of the Brazilian people?
An election is not the whole life history of a country. It's just a fragment. But an election is, in certain conditions, it can mean a historical turn, as in the case of this election, because Jair Bolsonaro means to go back for his proposal to a series of conquests that the Brazilian people have achieved around over 6 decades of a very important social, economic, and state matrix, and also political, labor and social rights that were a lever for Brazil to rise, to be one of the largest economies in the world. Then it is not a small thing if it is proposed to destroy everything that has meant that lever. So there is so much objection because the people are preparing to desist a process of return, and this leads to have a lot of protest and a lot of struggle.
What motivates the Brazilian people? What were some of those benefits you had in recent years?
For example, since it was founded, the Petrobras, which is one of the most important shale oil companies of the world, that has discovered a lot of oil for its own technology, there is a technological development. Bolsonaro promises, or at least its economic advisors, they promised to privatize the Petrobras more than it did the social rights, the labor rights, that in Brazil have expanded plenty since the 40s. When Getúlio Vargas managed to install a social structure of social protection to the workers, maternity leave, previdency rights, social security, that are also targeted by the president-elect as enemies and as responsible for economic hardship, which is not true. This topic is in another sphere, the economic difficulty. For example, you have to wonder why, since Lula was elected in 2002, the country grew a lot. Increased income, increased wages, under child morality, and expanded social law. If it's possible, why is this now transformed into the cause of being, let's say, responsible for the evils, all the ills of the country?
About that, I wanted to ask specifically because Bolsonaro is assuming when proclaiming those elections said, I wanted to start a government from next year that can really put Brazil in an important place. Was not Brazil already in an important place in Latin America and in the world?
Obviously, Brazil is already a very important economy in the world, right? And reached that position with a policy that exactly is a policy that Bolsonaro promises to destroy. An economy policy to give more prominence to the state, have companies like Petrobras, the Electrobras, were responsible for Brazil to be transformed into a world energy power potence, a potence on mining, a potence also in the area of technology, because Brazil has aircraft factory, has a very advanced industry, and that was all done for a step with social law. It was not a fair thing of something else, and when Lula arrives and the PT, the power, Lula managed to distribute the rent and continue to strengthen these pillars. Even the defense industry itself, right? Lula never had an attitude of hostility towards the military. On the contrary, strengthened the budgets for the program of the nuclear submarine, for military program, the military programs in general. There was much cooperation with Brazil with Argentina for the construction of tanks, cargo planes, very advanced. So Brazil was already one of the fifth or the sixth largest economy in the world when a process of sabotage starts blaming the PT for all the evils of the world. That was exaggerating. It was a forgery, right? And what was sought by the conservative authors was the destruction of the PT, and they didn't succeed.
But why destroy the PT?
Because the PT is banking that summons people democratically to participate and that makes the authors tremble. More oligarchs do not want the participation of people, does not want the equal society, do not want the opening, for example, of the universities to the poor, to the Negroes, the Indians. All that was done with the PT. So there was an intention, a social hatred to destroy the PT, and did not achieve, because the same in that election that was defeated by Bolsonaro, the PT had 40% of the votes, the largest parliamentary bench in the chamber, and several governments of provinces also, they failed to destroy the PT. The PT continues and also prepares to resist, organize and summon the people to maintain the democratic right. Any attempt of Bolsonaro to violate the constitution, to violate the rights, you will find a strong resistance of the PT, of the unions, of the social movements.
But is the Brazilian people also prepared to be part of the call that the PT makes and to which the workers of the unions are called to join in?
Of course, that's a challenge, isn't it? Because there was from 2016, with the blow that collapsed Dilma Rousseff, a series of attacks on trade unions, the PT attack for 16 years, was an attack to destroy, right? And the attack on the unions was an attack that sought to weaken them. Changing the law, the Trade Union Finance Act, and they succeeded because the parliamentary coup was mostly within parliament, and most were constituted by force economic. They have the oligarch parliamentarians supported by external sectors, which have interest in the denationalization of oil, wealth. Then of course it is a challenge. Cannot be guaranteed that the resistance will be victorious, but there is no another path that is not to resist, because it was always the history of the PT and the history before the PT, the resistance of the country to all the plan of denationalization of submission of Brazil, to international plans or to a North American geopolitics. For example, always Brazil existed, built its own path until it reached the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world.
That path of resistance, that self-determination, not only of Brazil but of Latin America, the moment that is currently being lived, that setback, return to right-wing, neoliberal governments, how does this insert into social integration policies that have been taking place over the years in the region?
Integrationist policies are at risk. For example, the man that was indicated for home economics, Bolsonaro, Paul Guedes, said that Mercosur is no longer a priority. When Mercosur was founded in the early 80s, Mercosur was already an opposition of America, because it was an initiative of the countries of the region. The United States didn't like this because they dislike any initiative that it doesn't control. It was an initiative outside control, but that is strengthened with the election of Lula. Mercosur is strengthened even more, even with the plan of works of logistics for Paraguay, to Uruguay, Argentina, which Brazil, by the size of its economy, could play a major role. And if the main instrument of Mercosur is Brazil, the Brazil's economy stop acting, that will weaken the process, as well as going to weaken integration in Telesur, in the SLAC, and Brazil's role among the BRICS will be marked by, first, a withdrawal from Brazil as a protagonist, and after by traditions which will exacerbate, especially in relation to China, which is the biggest commercial partner of Brazil and which cannot hop in hand of this position.
With the strength of Bolsonaro, then, and that aggressiveness, that aggression in a certain way, the progressive governments of Latin America, what could happen then for countries such as Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua?
There is a double policy sense, doesn't it? First, it has a speech of Bolsonaro, who is very aggressive speech. The campaign, but yesterday already gave a statement that will comply with the constitution. Then your whole way of thinking, his vision of politics is a vision of being aligned to the vision of American geopolitics. That is very clear. So much that his first trip will be to Israel, primary entity, then USA, then Chile. That can mean and explain.
¿Por qué acercarse a? Why approaching to the American government, the European Union? Why that intention?
Porque é sua visão ideológica, ele exalta Estados Unidos.
Because it is an ideological decision. He jumps in favor of the United States. He has very strong relations of sympathy with Israel, also because Piñera in Chile summons it to make part alliance for the Pacific despite the fact that Brazil is in the Atlantic, ideologically, not geographically. This will mean weakening Mercosur and seeking a more connected alliance, more synchronized with American interests for Latin America. So that is an explanation, but at the same time, progressive governments like Bolivia, as Venezuela in the region, then can one, the first, the word of Bolsonaro had enough of aggression, right? Against Venezuela, against Bolivia, against Cuba, against Nicaragua, but it's indicated man as the Minister of the General Defense, Augusto Núñez, already declared that doesn't. It does not take part of the objective to take any kind of aggression against Venezuela, for example. Because there is a situation that more permanent than in Brazil happens. The Brazilian military doctrine was always to seek a close regional stability. So perhaps it worries much more with Colombia than with Venezuela. Then, in that sense, seeking a peaceful coexistence with respect to the other determination should be not only because it is in the constitution that Bolsonaro promised to respect, but also because these countries could be. There's an Eastern thing that Brazil comes, or better, China buys oil from Venezuela and buys rice from Brazil. And that rice that buys from Brazil is delivered by China, who sends it to deliver to Venezuela. Brazilian enterprises think that it would be much better that there was a very good relationship with Venezuela, even commercially, because it would not depend on a triangular relationship with China to take care of this. It could win a lot more, right? As it when there was a very good relation between Brazil and Venezuela that grew a lot of bilateral trade, quite a lot. As with Argentina, with other countries, then in that sense the general said that no kind of assault is expected against Venezuela, which I think responds to this permanent doctrine, because any confusion in South America can also mean presence of American troops.
But I was just going to say that by joining the United States in seeking alliance with the European Union as well, how is the relationship of Brazil within the community of states of Latin American countries, with Venezuela specifically? Recently, Temer offered a better life for Venezuelans who were in Brazil. And in a way, he created a situation of xenophobia towards Venezuelans. Why? Why is this happening? Why seek that quarrel with neighboring countries?
There was an electoral dispute. Also, there was just a lot of more ghosts like Venezuela in favor. The electoral victory used one thing to favor it, and was always media on the part of, especially the TV balloon, a very large hostility against Venezuela, against Cuba above all. But look at Brazil when they choose Lula. Lula does not break relationship with the United States. On the contrary, does not assume, does not accept all these plans. For example, Lula refused to send troops for the war of Iraq, and as it was requested by George Walker, Lula denied, said no, of course. That meant a very bitter price for Lula, but at the same time, Brazil remained good commercial purchaser of the United States. It had discrepancy, but when also Brazil enters BRICS, that will find geopolitical interests in North America, because it is associated with Russia, with China, with South Africa, and also with India. Then in that sense, yes, but with the European Union, Brazil always had good relations, but no subaltern relations. Good relations. Good trade sought even to develop those relations, but it doesn't submit. Why? Because the European Union, the countries of the European Union, the most advanced, has a very large stock of raw material to export, has no market there. Raw material of technological developed goods to develop, and want Brazil to be only supplier of raw material. But Brazil also has a very important industrial level. It does not want to be only receiver of more developed products. It wants also to have a trade that had never managed to find a balance in this demand, like Michel Temer, with his rhetoric in addition to what he said in relation to Venezuela, that did not fulfilled. There were internal pressures. Some Venezuelans were in civilian, but not in the way that Michel Temer had obviously promised, but in relation to the European Union. Brazil with Temer, and Temer will be continued by Bolsonaro, because Bolsonaro is the aggravated continuation of radical Temer, had a process of greater submission to countries such as the United States and the European Union. That will change because Bolsonaro must completely submit to a North American view above all, not so much the European Union.
Could it be making a historical moment of need for Latin American countries to pay more attention to those who choose to represent them?
Yes, it is a difficult historical moment, very serious, because, look, any important work in Latin America, to give a very important and practical example, yes, there is a need to make an important infrastructure work like the one that was done in Cuba, in Puerto Mariel, as they did here in Venezuela or in Peru, in Bolivia. And these countries can find in Brazil a technological capacity to do so, advanced engineering capacity, and also give the support to those works where North American countries have no interest in investing. Then at that moment, when politics changes in Brazil, that will mean losing a point, an important lever for integration in historical terms, and that means that the possibility of reducing the asymmetries of the region, the two most advanced countries, Brazil and Argentina, of the industrial point of view, live, right? First, because this Macri, with a retrograde policy, and now Brazil also, happens to have an even more retrograde policy to Timor, and that would mean a prejudice for all countries in the region that, say, lose the possibility of reducing historical deadlines for Latin America integration. It will be much harder than there is a rather bigger price for the whole region.
Is Latin America and the Caribbean prepared to pay that price to balance its integration, its unity?
Of course, countries have their own policy, autonomy, and sovereignty. The presence of a Brazilian more in favor of integration would mean reducing historical deadlines. But it doesn't mean that those countries are, let's say, in another possibility. Each one's going to find their way wisely with their intelligence, with the support of their people to defend the guideline in development programs they have. But they can no longer candy Brazil as partner. That's the difference. Then the deadlines are lengthened. It's much more difficult to develop of the region.
Would it be a Brazil not as a partner, but a Brazil in favor of integration?
Agora vai ser Brasil com muito mais sintonia com os Estados Unidos do que muito.
Now it's going to be a Brazil much more attuned to America, which is really bad, right? For example, the projects that helped Paraguay, the exchange between Brazil and Uruguay, all this politics, the vision of the economic policy of Bolsonaro will be a prejudice for those countries, ceases to be a stimulus, the one that could be an impulse as it was before. Even Brazil came to support, for example, Paraguay, in electrification, for example, in a lost fund, right? That is not because Paraguay has the largest hydroelectric company in the world, Itapu, but Asunción is the capital, did not have a balanced supply of energy against need. With this work that was done, there was a more cooperative Mercosur spirit. That is a complete loss. In Paul Guedes said, Mercosur ceases to be a priority. It is very bad for the countries of Mercosur, also for the countries of the region, the OMA cooperative, or the OMA of solidarity, or the OMA of fairness, more equitable trade, right, with funding, because Brazil also has a state development bank that financed a number of infrastructure projects, and that will end. Surely there will not be no funding for projects such as Mariel, for example, that Bolsonaro. He won't allow it.
Thank you very much, Beto Almeida, international analyst, for sharing with us at Telesur. These are the latest informations about Brazil. This has been From Caracas. Today we talk with Beto Almeida, an international analyst who've been part of Telesur in the last 13 years, who update us of the challenges facing that Latin America and the Caribbean face in these coming years.